Sean, we got a little notification from YouTube about our conversation yesterday concerning the topic of abortion. A little warning, something about that.
Talk about signs you're over the target.
Yeah.
You're nobody until YouTube has flagged you, right?
Again.
Yeah.
Well, all sense of grace here. We were informed that our discussion yesterday on the topic of abortion required context as far as what abortion is, and they provided a Wikipedia article for clarification. So I figured that being the instigator that I am, is an opportunity for us to clarify what is the biblical view of abortion. Would you like to take the scientific approach and I'll take the biblical, or would you like to do the biblical?
Either way, when the subject of abortion comes up, the basic approach that I take on this is that it comes down to one question, and that question is this: when does life begin? There are those who will say, well, nobody knows when life begins, and everybody's got a different opinion on the subject, and they will cite this person and that. The problem with that is that scientifically there is no doubt about when human life begins. It begins at the moment of conception. No scientist worth his salt is going to tell you that a fertilized egg is an inanimate object. It is a being. It is a being with a certain genetic endowment, the same 46 chromosomes that you and I have. It is a being that is human. The only difference between you and me and a fertilized egg, the very first stage of human development, is time and nurture. That's it. Everything that makes you you was there at that moment. Your hair color, your eye color, your height, your tendency to gain weight or be able to lose weight, all these different things were all present at that very moment. So when someone says we don't know when life begins, actually, in fact, we do. Now, since we know when life begins, it only seems to stand to reason that if our life began at that particular point, the idea of drawing an arbitrary line in terms of fetal development and saying prior to this point this was not a human being simply does not stand up under scientific or logical examination.
Yeah, so if we're going to then just take the logic at face value, what are the facts on the table? Well, first let's start with something that even the secularist can agree with us on. When it comes to the scientific facts surrounding unborn children, and this might just be a bit of trivia for you, but when they say that's not a child, that's a fetus, Adrian, can you help me out here? My Latin's a little rusty. What does fetus mean in Latin?
Human?
It means baby.
Baby, sorry. Human
Point
baby.
stands. But with that being said, when it comes to the claim that life begins at conception and that it is due to all the dignities therein, first of all, when we call, if you haven't had this talk yet, you can talk to your parents later, but the material from the man and the material from the woman come together, each bring with them 23 chromosomes that make up one zygote. That's the medical term for it. Now, everything that is within that single cell will begin to divide, and if unimpeded and if uninterrupted, it will continue to develop into what we observe as a human baby, in the same way that if my growth and development is left unimpeded and uninterrupted, I will also grow to be at least somewhat resembling the man to my left. The difference between us and a zygote is literally the same difference between a child and an adult, and that is time and nurture. Now, obviously, there's a very unique environment for that zygote to develop properly, but the point still stands as far as what substantively, cellularly, and compositionally makes that up. No one would debate that. Also note,
scripturally, how do we also justify this?
Well, let me finish the secular perspective to appease the Wikipedia article, and then we'll get into that. The second thing that we need to keep in mind is that biological development throughout the trimesters does not support the claim that humanity develops more than the same developments that take place between those two time periods. For example, the first trimester, as far as the first moment of conception, when the first two cells divide within a zygote, it is now growing the same way that you and I are. Within the first 2 weeks, cells continue to divide into specific categories to produce organs and body parts. We don't see it changing into a whale or a chicken. Those organs and that development is and always will produce human features. The third week is that the zygote is now what's called a blastocyst and will remain where it is in the mother until birth. The fourth week has the nervous system and the heart fully formed, which are, by the way, the same two things we measure to determine whether or not a life has ended. And by the way, the two men here who have observed their little ones in gestation, if you will, did you guys even know that you were pregnant by around the first month?
Well, I've never been pregnant, but
Well, the statement is saying you're observing your wife,
Yeah.
and within the first month,
No,
that's when
no.
signs might begin to show if they're really paying attention.
I have a recording of a heartbeat at 5 weeks.
So, after that first month, before those things are
We knew
even
we were,
noticed.
knew
Because you
we
were paying real attention, right?
We were paying close attention, and we knew we were pregnant within the first 3 to 4 weeks. And then by the 5th week, we had already scheduled an ultrasound, and were able to see and record our first son's heartbeat
Yeah,
at 5 weeks.
A little callus blastocyst form,
Because
right?
we knew the conception date, so we knew he was exactly 5 weeks.
All right. Well, speaking of 5 weeks, at that time, heartbeat and circulatory system aren't created, they're fully functional within the baby. Also note, at the 6th week, the nose, mouth, ears are also developing, and the brain is growing. At the 7th week, arms and legs are beginning to form. At the 8th week, the baby can breathe and feel pain. Note that. At the 9th week, the baby's body is now developed to how it will look as a human and is only small at that point. At the 10th week, skin is now functional and fingernails begin to form. The 11th week notes the baby can kick and hiccup with their diaphragm now intact, much to the chagrin of the mother, I'm sure. At the 12th week, the baby now has reflexes and can respond to activity. That's probably when Adrian was starting to teach him magic tricks, I'm sure. At the 13th week, the first trimester ends with all of the baby's organs fully functional and the gender confirmed. Now, at this point, about, I don't want to give out a percentage, but the overwhelming majority of abortion legislation or anti-abortion legislation, or as it's referred to in some social media circles, the violation of human rights, would allow an abortion at this point when the baby can feel pain, looks fully human, and is now functioning as a human and is just small. But going on to the second trimester, and I'll be brief about this so we can get to the Bible, but noting that the majority of protests against abortion restriction allow it at this time as well. Facial muscles begin to form. They're reacting to lights and sounds. Their muscles can function. Their joints and cartilage are fully functional. The skin is no longer translucent, and their nerves are all where they need to be. All 5 senses are intact at the 19th week, which, if I'm doing my division and fractions, if we have on average around 4 weeks to a month, how many months of pregnancy does that put someone at 19? Help me out here. Maybe almost 5 months.
Yeah, 5, close to that. Yep.
Interesting. Also note, the baby can digest and swallow at this point, and the baby begins sleeping, developing fat, and even growing hair. The third trimester is where modern abortion laws would also make this legal at this stage. The baby's growing, the bones are hardening, eye color forms, and mama gets big. I'll just say that. But upon the 4th trimester, this is again where the majority of legislation for abortion limitation is still allowing an abortion to take place. The baby's born. That's it. The only things that need to form at this point are the full closing of the skull, getting used to breathing air through crying, and of course the diet switches from fluid in the belly button to milk and eventually solid foods. And of course muscles begin to grow, but as you can see, even I'm still working on that.
A lot of the cartilage in the joints doesn't exist. It's just like jello, but the cartilage forms as the body begins to be used, walk. We had a scare. We took our firstborn to like one of those trampoline places.
yeah.
And they have an hour scheduled just for the littles. But there were big kids there, and he just ran. And if you ever jumped on a trampoline, if you don't jump in sync with the other people, you get launched. And so he ran across a small one that some kid was, 4 times his size, bouncing up and down. He landed just as the kid was going down, and it just pushed up on his leg and just launched him into the air. He was limping. This is our first injury. He's not even barely 11 or 13 months old, 14, because he started walking at 9 to 10 months, so he was very, very
He's a big boy.
Yeah.
athletic.
Yeah.
And we took him to the urgent care, and they said, "Oh, he's fine. You don't need to X-ray. He can't tear a ligament or anything because it's just jello in there anyway. He's got muscles, but the ligaments are still forming as they begin toughen out over time." So,
And this is in the
Interesting.
5th trimester.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
all that then being said, those are the facts on the table. And if we're going to argue this point, understand that within the first semester, if you're willing to just talk someone and walk someone through these ideas, the idea that an abortion is justified when they can feel pain, when they're aware of stimuli, when their brain's fully formed and their nervous system's fully intact, most people, unless they've made up their minds for them before the conversation started, or at least since they last looked at their social media platforms, it's not going to end in any meaningful sense. They're just going to tune you out, and they'll answer to God for what they say. But when it comes to fellow Christians, so follower of Christ, all a follower of Christ, there are standards that we're held to that are more than just observation. We, as my father was saying, have a accountability to what God has revealed, and if we call ourselves followers of Christ, we should take seriously what he said.
Right.
And in Scripture, obviously, there weren't, in the same way they're exercised today, abortions. There was infanticide and the justification and dismissal of it, for sure. We call it Moloch worship. But when it comes to scriptural evidence and reason for us to say, I cannot side with any pro-choice legislation because it is knowingly encouraging the taking of a human life. The reason we would come to this is because of these passages. First of all, when we go into the first trimester being identified as a life, we have an example of that both in the Gospel of Luke chapter 41 and 43, where, of course, Mary being told when she was still within that first 6-month period, at the time that Elizabeth was, of
Right.
course, in the 6-month period, she was, well, Jesus was at the time, 3 months, and yet, rightly so, Elizabeth identifies the child in her womb as who? Her Lord.
Right.
The mother. She hadn't given birth yet, so why would she be calling herself a mother? Well, that is an interesting observation given the perspective the Bible lays out. Because note, when we're reading the Bible, we don't look for a list of rules saying you shall not commit abortion, you shall not support legislation up to or limited to the 2nd trimester, and so forth. We look for truth statements and ask ourselves, does this line up with my values?
Right.
So if we have an example, both in Luke 1 and in Matthew 1, where the angel Gabriel tells him the child, not the clump of cells that could potentially become a child, but the child that is in you will be called Jesus, for he will save his people from his sins. These are the things that we would look at and say, that doesn't check out, because at the Matthew point, that was before the 4-week mark. And when we look at the Luke passage, that's still within first trimester range.
Right.
So this is the arguments being made. Also note, we are told that these babies in Scripture are spiritually aware before they are born. In the same passage in Luke chapter 1 and verse 36 through 43, John the Baptist in the 2nd trimester reacts to the presence
Right.
of Jesus when
Right.
he's also in the first trimester. That's interesting. We're told that they are not only spiritually aware before their birth, but that God was aware of them. In Jeremiah chapter 1 and verse 5, he's identified not just as a living being, but someone with an occupation, a spiritual calling. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. I ordained you a prophet to the nations. We can go to Psalm 139, 13 through 16, where David makes the observation of God knowing him in his unformed substance when he was still in his mother's womb. We can go to Isaiah 49:1, where he makes the same observation as Jeremiah. We can go to Psalm 51 and verse 5, where David observes moral culpability for his sins when he's still in the womb. And we could also note legally, if you want a list of rules, in Exodus 21 verses 22 through 23, so there's an ascending order there to the passages in the chapter, but a capital offense for taking a life if you cause a woman to miscarry through violence. So the life of a unborn child is
Right.
treated just as if you had taken the life of a born child
Right.
or a grown child, if in this case it was a fight between immature people.
Yeah.
But that's the point that we're making. That's the Christian perspective on abortion. When we reconcile these passages with the propaganda that's leveled to us on a daily basis, we have to choose sides. We have to determine loyalties. Do I have more reason to trust God or people who are willing to, or in hopefully most cases unwilling to, look at the straight facts that we can both agree on, Christian or not, and say this is a human being, scientifically, biologically, observationally, but I repeat myself. So when it comes to this issue, make sure that first of all you don't, like our previous question, take it personally when people are literally looking in the face of a human being and are willing to kill it because that's just the tribe that they're associated with. Lawlessness is abounding this day, we shouldn't be surprised. But if you come up to someone who is at least has a fraction of their soul left and is capable of looking at, say, a fetal development chart, or you're willing to go through the stages of development, don't just send them this video, actually look up and verify what we're talking about here. We're willing to be accountable for that. And say, so at what time would you say humanity has entered? Which is why I took special care to identify the details of the first trimester and noting that's when most people are willing to abort without consequence. Yet those are the very things where they say, as long as they don't feel pain. They can feel pain before you're even aware they're there.
Yeah.
Unless you're really paying attention, right, Adrian?
Yeah.
So the point being made is just that. What's the Christian perspective on abortion? Wikipedia has its opinions, but here are the facts. Everything that makes a human being is at conception, not at an arbitrarily determined time by your local government.